Hello and welcome to Nature Knowledge. This is a speaker series with experts sharing scientific knowledge on current issues affecting nature in Florida. I'm your host, Dr. Shelly Johnson, State Specialized Agent in Natural Resources with University of Florida IFAS Extension. Thanks for joining us today.
And our speaker and topic for today, I'm excited to have. The topic is Understanding Climate Change in Florida, and our speaker is Holly Abeels. She's a Florida Sea Grant Extension Agent with IFAS Extension in Brevard County, and she's also a certified climate change professional. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen. I'm going to go ahead and throw it over to Holly.
Thanks so much, Shelly, and thank you everyone for coming here today. I'm so glad we have a big audience, and I'm excited that everyone's here to learn about climate change in Florida. So if you're outside of Florida, I apologize. I won't have a lot of specifics outside of Florida. There are a couple things, but mainly my focus is on Florida because that's probably where the most of you are coming from, and that's what I'm most knowledgeable about. But again, thank you, Shelly, for that introduction. My name is Holly Abeels, and we're gonna just delve right into this. I do have the chat closed, so I won't be able to see any questions. So I'm hoping as we go along, you'll have some wonderful questions, I'm sure, and I'll answer those at the end. So I do have a question to start with you all, and you're welcome to put this in the chat. Is a word or a phrase that comes to mind when you hear the words climate change or global warming? And I will briefly look at the chat so I can just see what some of the answers are. So water, sea level rise, yeah. Lots of sea level rise, that's what usually a lot of people think of. Bathing suits, yeah. Migration, uncertainty, too hot to garden, that's a good one. Changing weather and water, heat, high water, extreme weather, corporations, extinctions, yeah. Anthropogenic driven, okay, yeah, lots of great answers. It's always nice to hear or see like what people are thinking when they think of climate change or global warming. So yeah, thank you for that. Please feel free to keep putting those in. I'll look at them later when we're at the end. And so if you have heard of climate change, you probably are very much aware that weather and climate are not the same thing. So I just want to start with that basic right now. So weather is what's happening outside your window right now. So I actually took this picture on the left at 11 o'clock this morning. It was cloudy, and that is what the weather looked like at 11. And then of course at 1, it started pouring, and it actually is pouring right now. So I don't know where you're at, but it could be raining, it could be sunny, it could be cloudy. And usually in general, we probably watch the weather in the morning, or we have our like a weather app on our phone, and that lets us know what the temperature is going to be like during the day, whether we should bring a raincoat or umbrella. If you go outside, what really you should be wearing to kind of, for the rest of your day before you leave your house. And we also can get, kind of weather forecasts for like the next couple of days, right? So we can have an idea of what the temperature will be like probably in the next week. If you're traveling somewhere, you probably look at like what the weather is going to be like of where you're traveling, so you know how to prepare with clothes and stuff like that. And especially if you're going on vacation, whether or not you'll have a nice sunny, warm or cold, depending on where you're going on vacation. So we know weather changes minute by minute, day by day. If you live here in Florida, we have like pop-up thunderstorms that happen. So this is the short term. It's a limited area we're usually talking about, changes rapidly, and it's difficult to predict for the most part. Climate, though, is the average of many years of weather reservations. So we're talking long-term, and long-term in climate world usually means 30 years or more. We're talking a wide area, so not just what's happening in your city or your county at the time. And it takes into account seasonal changes. So things that might be happening at different times of the year from year to year. So I'm going to talk a little bit about climate normals in a little bit. This was kind of a hot topic last year about the new climate normals and what that means. But when I'm talking about climate, I'm talking long term. So I'm not talking about what's happening, what just happened the past couple months or even the past year. I'm talking about 30 years or more of what's been going on. And climate is affected by a lot of factors. So latitude, ocean currents, evaporation, even volcanic activity. So these are abiotic factors, which are non-living parts of an ecosystem that shapes in its environment. We also have biotic factors. So that's a living organism shaping an environment. So we often think of things like plants, like transpiration, respiration, photosynthesis, decomposition, so breaking down of materials, and digestion. So these are all things that are happening by living organisms in our environment that could affect climate. And you probably already know or are aware that when we're talking about climate change, a lot of the things, and probably one of the focus that we often are talking about is greenhouse gases. So these are listed here, the most common greenhouse gases we refer to. So water vapor, carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. And carbon dioxide is the one we hear most about. But these other ones also come into play when we're talking about climate change as well. And it's actually a really good thing that we have these greenhouse gases. Without greenhouse gases and without the greenhouse effect, Earth would be a frozen world. So it'd be a lot different of a world if we didn't have these greenhouse gases. So the greenhouse gases trap sunlight that hits the Earth and reflects it back, causing the Earth to warm. And sometimes this greenhouse effect in the education circles is often called or referred to as a heat trapping blanket, because it's an easy way for people to understand how important this greenhouse effect is to life on Earth. It's trapping a blanket, it's trapping that heat underneath. But as we know, too much carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases in the air makes Earth get warmer and warmer. And scientists have known about this greenhouse effect since the 1800s. So this isn't something that's new. We've known about this for a long time. Another part of that cycle is the carbon cycle. So carbon is a really important element on our world, and all living things are made of carbon. It's also part of the ocean, the air, even rocks. And because the Earth is a really dynamic place, the carbon doesn't necessarily stay still. It's always kind of moving into the cycle from one organism or area to another. So in the atmosphere, carbon's attached to some oxygen and a gas called carbon dioxide. Plants use that carbon dioxide and sunlight to make their own food and to grow, and carbon becomes part of the plant. So after a while, the plants die and they're buried, and they could, over many millions of years, turn into fossil fuels. And that's what our coal and our oil are made of, that carbon. So when we take that out of the ground and we burn those fossil fuels, most of that carbon is really quickly entered into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. And we've seen over time this carbon dioxide levels increasing in our atmosphere. So this is something that's measurable, something that we have measured over time. And because we know that carbon dioxide is that greenhouse gas, we know that it helps to trap heat and it helps keep our planet warm. So when we're talking about climate change, we're referring really mainly to the increase of carbon dioxide and those greenhouse gases in our atmosphere over time. And so as we see that carbon dioxide increases and fluctuates, the temperature increases over time as well. So we know how much carbon has been in the atmosphere, but we don't necessarily know how much carbon will be in the atmosphere in the future. We can make some projections based on how much fossil fuels we have left, in the world to burn. And so we can kind of project how much carbon might potentially be released in the atmosphere, but there's all kinds of sinks or ways that carbon is kind of stored as well. So sometimes it can be difficult to predict really what we're going to see in the future. And I'm really just, I like these climate central kind of graphics because it's really easy for people to understand, just kind of changes that we've seen over time. And I'll be using a bunch of these climate central graphics in this talk. And really what I just want to point out here is that, currently, or back in 2019, our carbon dioxide level reached 410 parts per million. And I mean, I remember a time even in my lifetime when scientists talked about not going over 350 parts per million of carbon dioxide. There was actually a whole organization called 350.org that was working towards reducing carbon dioxide to below that level. And then there was talk about reducing it so it wouldn't go over 400, and now we're above 410. So we've surpassed those numbers. But really what we are doing in the climate world, and when people are planning for climate change and trying to adapt and mitigate, we're really just trying to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide that is in our atmosphere. I also want to briefly talk about the causes of sea level rise, since many of you did bring that up, and that is often, besides carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases, sea level rise is another thing that people often think about when they think of climate change, and that of course is really important here in Florida. So the two major causes of global sea level rise are thermal expansion of the oceans. So water expands as it gets warmer. We probably all learned this in school at some point. And then the second part is the loss of land-based ice due to increased melting. So I'm not referring to icebergs or ice that's already in the water. I'm talking about ice that's on land. So if you think of like ice in a glass of water, the water level doesn't change as the ice melts because it already has displaced that water. But when water melts on land, it's basically like a new river of water that's going into the ocean. And this melting of the ice sheets, how much they will melt, how much it will affect sea level rise is actually a big area of science and also a big unknown. So we're really not sure or positive how much this will affect sea level rise into the future because we don't know how soon or how much or the glaciers will be decreasing in the near future. So more information about that will come out as science looks at this factor more. But these are the two reasons why sea levels rise. Another important thing to note about sea level rise is that sea level doesn't rise evenly around the world. So there are some places like along the northern Gulf of Mexico, like around Louisiana, where sea level is actually rising faster there compared to other parts of the United States because the land is actually shrinking. So it's actually kind of like, because that's a big area where oil and fossil fuels are taken out, the land is actually kind of sinking down because it's losing those fossil fuels that would normally be underneath the ground. If they're taken out, the land kind of sinks. And so sea levels are actually rising more there. Other places like Alaska, the sea level is either not rising or it's getting lower because the land is actually rising because those glaciers that used to be on top of the land, they are very, very heavy and they were keeping the land down. But as they melt, the land kind of bounces back up from those melting glaciers. And so sea level rise doesn't look like it's rising there because the land is actually increasing in height. But overall, global average sea level has risen by about 8 inches. Oops, sorry about that. 8 inches since the 1900s, with about 3 of those inches occurring since 1993. So that the rate of global sea level rise has increased in the very recent decades. So the current rate is a little more than 1 inch per decade. And you can just see on this graph data that we've had in the past measuring that's global sea level rise. We're looking at a global scale here. This isn't specific to one area. And of course, we use a lot of satellite data today to be able to also help us see what global sea level rise is looking like across the world. I wanted to just show this map because I'll kind of talk about this a little bit later, especially when it comes to those counties that are at most risk to climate change. This map shows the world's top climate risks by 2040 if the greenhouse gas emissions are not cut drastically. So There's a couple things on here to note. We're looking at these varying levels of risks. So flooding, heat stress, water stress, wildfires, hurricanes, and typhoons, and sea level rise, and the areas that'll be most affected by these type of risks. Another thing to just think about is that oftentimes it's not just one thing that we're being affected by when it comes to climate change. So we could see both flooding and heat stress in an area. So it's not like we're just going to see just flooding or just heat stress. A lot of these risks are compounding. So, and really there's more than 2/3 of the world's countries have 2 or more of these risks. The United States has regions that can have all 6 of the risks. So they can have all flooding, heat stress, water stress, wildfires, hurricanes, and sea level rise. So, there's just some areas that are going to be seeing maybe a couple of these, but then definitely a lot of areas that are going to see all of these effects. And really, one of the important things to just think about at the worldwide scale is that, 90% of the world's population, both rich and poor countries alike, will be exposed to one or more of these threats arising from global sea level rise. So a really important report came out just in February, the very end of February, so about a month ago, from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So they release these reports pretty frequently that kind of give different assessments about what's happening around climate change. So the most recent report showed like some similar things as previous reports, so the climate change is already causing more frequent and more severe storms, floods, droughts, wildfires, and other extreme weather events. And what makes this report different is that it includes more recent science. So it allows it to describe the effects of climate change with greater accuracy. So the increased frequency and severity of these events threaten the health and safety of millions of people around the world, both through indirect impacts and by making it harder to produce food or have access to clean water. And what's really troubling about this latest report, which you probably heard on the news, because it was very widespread in the information that came out of this report, is that scientists say that warming temperatures are leading to more compound extremes. So like the previous graph or map where I showed you, there were all these different types of climate risks. There is more of those and compounding, so multiple of those happening at the same time. So when these multiple climate hazards occur simultaneously in the same place, they affect multiple regions at the same time, or they occur in a sequence, so one after another. So for example, you could have sustained higher temperatures that could decrease soil moisture, which will suppress plant growth, which in turn reduces local rainfall, and then that can lead to drought. And so you just kind of get this big feedback loop. And like kind of the headline that came out of this is that there's a rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future. So we as a collective are not doing enough, and we actually need to do more sooner rather than later. So I'm going to talk about kind of like our natural resources infrastructure and other areas, our communities, and how they'll be impacted in a little bit more specifics. I'm going to focus mainly on temperature and precipitation. So if you, earlier in my talk, I was talking about the climate normals. And so the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration issues every 10 years these climate normals, and that's basically the baseline data of temperature, rain, snow, and other weather variables that are collected over the past 3 decades at thousands of locations across the country. So the normals, which use observation over the previous 30 years, are the basic weather data that we all make use of, and maybe not even realizing it. So one example is, how we know that yesterday's high temperature or low temperature was above or below normal. So if you ever hear like a weatherman or someone saying, oh, the temperature today is going to be above normal or will be below normal, they're actually using these climate normals to say whether or not the temperature will be above or below normal. So because the increase in the temperature of those normals has gone greater, as you can see from this map. When the weatherman says today's temperature will be 5 degrees above normal for this time of year, that normal temperature is actually based on a hotter temperature. So it's actually even hotter than it has been previously. And temperature is really important to think about. You're probably thinking, oh man, I might have to use my air conditioning more often. Very, very true. There's definitely areas where, these heat risks or these hot days or these red flag risks, are going to increase. I think it was last year, I don't know if you remember, like the upper Northwest, like Oregon and Washington, like they had 100, degree temperature days, which is really unheard of. Like that's definitely way above normal, right? But that is going to become the norm as our temperatures increase across the globe. Of course, we'll be affected here in the South. And these increasing temperatures have really the potential to gravely impact public health. So that's really why a lot of focus is on these temperatures. A lot of the communities that'll be affected will be the lower income families, often that can't afford air conditioning, or they maybe live in areas or in homes where air conditioning isn't available. People who work outside all day for a living, they will be greatly affected. And, people living in difficult housing conditions. That's why in a lot of these areas, when they do have those high temperatures, they do open up like cool centers, like places where people can go to get out of the heat, because it really does take a physical toll on your body to be hot for long periods of time. It also has an effect on our physical infrastructure, particularly in cities. So we have that heat island effect where our cities become warmer because of all the concrete and less trees, where all of that heat just kind of accumulates. And we have to protect our roads and our bridges and other transportation areas where those materials may not be able to withstand the high heat that we'll see over time. So warming is the new normal. Those climate normals, provide really important information for a lot of economic sectors. So they inform growers' decisions on when to plant crops and what crops to plant. So places that might be getting warmer, you actually might be able to plant different types of crops there because of that. Also have to think about rainfall as well in those situations, but there might be areas that might be too warm for some plants. So it goes both ways in that respect. Like electrical utilities will be looking at this because they need to be able to anticipate energy demand, especially in the very different seasons. And, construction projects also take into effect this because they need to know when, they can be able to have their workers out, working on construction projects. So you might be seeing more construction being done in the evening or late in, when the time of day is cooler, so that they can be able to stay outside for longer. And extreme heat, does look much different today, even than just 50 years ago. Of the 242 cities analyzed in the study, 142 of them, so 59%, experienced 3 or more additional days of extreme heat. And the 10 cities recording the greatest increases in the number of extremely hot days were all in the southern United States, so in our part of the country. And every year you probably hear, about this year or that particular year being one of the hottest on record. So back in 2020, that was this global temperatures were the second hottest on record, just behind 2016. Back in last year in 2021, it tied with 2018 as the 6th warmest year on record. So basically every year that goes by ends up being in the top 10 of hottest years on record. And this extreme heat really is dangerous. So it's the top weather killer, and it's especially difficult to shelter from. If you think of back in 2020, when people may or may not have been going outside, or maybe they didn't have air conditioning in their home where they could get away from the heat, this can pose really serious stress for those outdoor workers in lower income communities. And I highly recommend watching this really short documentary, which talks about Heat-related illnesses with farm workers here in Florida. And so this researchers at Emory University partnered with the Farm Worker Association of Florida to conduct this research on heat-related illness with farm workers in order to help employers to address workplace safety. So I will try to put this in the chat later, but of course you can always go back to the recording of this and look that link up. All right, next I'll briefly talk about precipitation. So precipitation is a little bit harder to look at into the future and to see any patterns from the past. So we can definitely say that temperatures are increasing. We can't necessarily say like every place is going to get more water or less water. In general, when we're talking about precipitation, we say, places that are already wet will probably get wetter. Places that are already dry will get drier. So that's kind of the best we can do with precipitation. This one is a lot harder to predict, but we do know that precipitation events, when they do happen, more rain happens in a shorter period of time. So we know that there's more rain occurring, more inches in a shorter period of time that are coming down when it does rain, and that often causes flooding in a lot of areas. So for extreme rainfall, the risk, kind of looks different. There'll be areas that, have a lower risk of extreme rainfall, so lots of rain. There's some areas that may or may not see a lot of that rain. Of course, there'll be areas that'll be dry, which you see here. So this water stress risk, where areas will see less water over time. And this is kind of in general looking at those patterns of, places that are already wet will get wetter, places that are already dry will get drier. Of course, this is really important for supplying water for people, for wastewater systems, for energy, for food, for agriculture. These are all different sectors that are really vulnerable to drought conditions. And we know that as the world does warm, there is more evaporation in general from our oceans, our lakes, our rivers, even from plants that transpire more. So for every 1 degree Fahrenheit of warming, the saturation level of the atmosphere increases by about 4%. So this means more water is available to condense into precipitation. And like I just said, it can come down in heavier downpours. And so those heavier rain events mean more flooding. So that could be flash flooding or larger river flooding, or maybe even streets flooding in areas that normally didn't flood, because the water can't quickly be removed from the system or from those roads like it normally did before, especially in areas where sea levels are rising. So this leads to property damage. Historical flooding maps might need to be redrawn to redress this risk. So that can affect both property values and insurance rates. Even if you just exclude tropical cyclones, individual billion-dollar flooding events in the US have added up to $39 billion in losses since 2020. So if you include tropical cyclones, it's over $400 billion. Another thing to think about is allergies. So anyone here have allergies? I know that I do. And, it seems like every year the allergy season, gets kind of worse and worse. And this will make it worse for people, and especially for people who maybe have respiratory problems like asthma sufferers. So those rising temperatures really are because of climate change, is the dominant contributor to changes in the timing and length of the pollen season in North America. So over the last half century, the growing season lengthened in 82% of the cities that Climate Central analyzed for this data. So that those carbon dioxide levels have a direct impact on pollen concentrations because it stimulates plant growth, right? More carbon dioxide, it's more food really for the plants. And so these pollen concentrations will increase. I also will say that because of temperature increases, less freezing days and different things like that, there will be areas that either different plants can grow or plants will be able to grow for longer. So there might be areas where agricultural products will increase, but there could also be areas where there'll be less agriculture because it might be getting too hot, or there might be less water for those products. And so with all that warm water and increased water in our atmosphere, that is the fuel for hurricanes. Climate change has heated up our ocean waters around the world by about 1 to 3 degrees Fahrenheit over the past century. And this includes in those regions where hurricanes do develop. So that allows for hurricanes to grow stronger, potentially increasing their maximum wind speed, or to become stronger in a quicker period of time. So we might not necessarily see more hurricanes, but they will intensify more quickly and be stronger overall. And of course, there's other factors, that limit how powerful hurricanes become, like wind changes and directions and stuff like that. But we certainly have seen over the past several years, hurricanes that have, been a small category 1 or 2 or tropical storm, and then all of a sudden they're like a category 5. So it's those types of things where we'll have more powerful hurricanes are going to continue because of those warm waters. And with hurricanes comes storm surge, and storm surge and coastal flooding in general is the biggest threat to people and what really causes the most deaths from hurricanes. And so you're going to see a lot more flooding, a greater storm surge in areas where hurricanes are coming ashore. So this is data from 2020, but every year, groups look at the billion-dollar disasters, especially when related to weather and climate events. And so in 2020, we saw 22 of these billion-dollar disasters, and it cost us a total of $96.4 billion and 262 deaths, unfortunately. And you can see where those occurred. So we continue to see, large numbers of billion-dollar, weather and climate event disasters, and could see more of these in the future. So I'm going to talk about climate hazards a little bit more, and kind of like that compounding effect that I've mentioned already a couple of times. So, there are areas where we're going to see these kind of compounding effects where we'll see, either more of these hazards or greater intensity of these different hazards. This is for the West Palm Beach area. So they'll see, obviously greater sea level rise, heat waves, water deficits. This is the Orlando area. So it's very similar: storms, heat waves, water deficits, warming, precipitation. So different areas are going to see those different kind of hazards and the intensity of hazards. And there was a study by ProPublica, which looked at over 3,000 counties and county equivalents in the United States, and looked at their climate risks based on impacts from heat, humidity, wildfires, sea level rise, farm crop yields, and economic damages. And so if you take all of these impacts together, some counties and parts of the US will see a number of these issues stacked one on top of the other. And so they become like the most at risk to climate change. So it's probably not surprising that Florida has many counties near the top of this list. We actually have 21 counties listed in the top 100 counties at most risk. So that was the answer to the question at the beginning of this session, is that 21 counties in Florida are in the top 10, 100 counties in the United States most at risk to these compounding climate risks. And some of these you might, obviously we have coastal counties. Some of these are not coastal counties though. So, there are things like that heat and humidity, or even fires or economic damages or farm yields, which have a greater effect instead of just sea level rise, which we often think about here in Florida. So climate change does already have an effect on us. It is already impacting carbon dioxide emissions, sea level rise, temperatures, shrinking ice sheets, hurricanes. I didn't even talk about ocean acidification because that's really a whole nother topic. And we'll continue to see these things over time. So we'll continue to see sea level rise, temperatures increasing, increase in flooding, not only tidal flooding, but other flooding, especially along our rivers and streams, changes in that precipitation, and even the spread of vector-borne diseases and health-related issues. So I didn't actually talk about vector-borne diseases, but if you think of things like mosquitoes, which transfer, some diseases that we know about and that we've heard about here in Florida, we could see more of those come up because mosquitoes will be able to travel to other places and not necessarily die from freezes like they normally would. So my last section is really talking about you guys and, you having a voice and your actions mattering. Even if you think one person can't make a difference, they can when it comes to all things sustainability related and even climate change related. I do want to very briefly just talk about the differences between mitigation and adaptation. So mitigation is actually reducing climate change. So this really just means reducing the flow of those greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So that's either reducing the source of the gases, so reducing or not burning fossil fuels for electricity, or enhancing the sinks that actually store these gases. So this is things like our forests, trees, our soils. Soils are really important for kind of taking in that carbon dioxide. Healthy soils can be big contributors of sinks of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases. And of course, our oceans are a big sink. We actually would see much larger effects of climate change if it weren't for our oceans, because they've actually absorbed, I think it's over half of the carbon dioxide we've put into the air to date. But we don't know how long they'll be able to continue to do that. So that's another unknown. So our goal of mitigation is really to avoid significant human interference with the climate system and to stabilize those greenhouse gas levels. So oftentimes when you hear about, keeping our temperature limit to like 2 degrees Celsius, not going, all right, we're using mitigation to do that. So we're saying we need to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions that are going into the atmosphere in order to reduce the amount of temperature increase that we're going to see. And then adaptation is actually just adapting to life in a changing climate. So this is doing things like not building in flood-prone areas, looking at maybe longer growing seasons or increased yields in some regions and having that, benefit us. Looking at sea level rise, encroachment, more extreme weather events, or food insecurity. So we're looking at the effects of climate change, and we're trying to adjust to that or adapt to that over time. So those are the two different types of ways to respond to climate change. So for you, for things that you can do, everything on here is related to probably something you've heard related to sustainability in the past. So you're looking for Energy Star appliances. So basically any way that you can reduce the amount of electricity that you use, or using renewable energy. So if you can put solar on your home, that's a great way to reduce your use of fossil fuels. Using water efficiently. So we will become a water stress community. So like water will become not as abundant as it is today, really anywhere that you are. So thinking about how you're using water and using less of it, being green in your yard. So thinking about the types of plants and products that you might be putting on your yard. We've been hearing about reducing, reusing, and recycling for forever, but think about refusing as well, or reusing. So, not purchasing something or not using something if you don't have to. So think of like plastic bags, so refusing those, or instead of buying new, try to buy used, or try to fix something before buying new, those types of things. So thinking about the choices that you make as a consumer. Buying smart, so purchasing fuel efficient, low greenhouse gas vehicles or electric vehicles. Those will become more and more popular as the years continue, and there'll be more communities that put in charging stations so that people feel more comfortable about having those, electric vehicles. And then giving your car a break. So trying not to use your car if you don't have to, walk or bike somewhere if possible. wanted to include this in because trees are a really important part of curbing climate change because they do remove carbon dioxide from our atmosphere. So through the process of photosynthesis, forests offset 10 to 20% of the country's greenhouse gas emissions every year. And they also protect against climate impacts such as flooding because they catch rainwater, they reduce erosion, they create more permeable soils. So they help prevent nearly 400 billion gallons of runoff, annually. They're also really important for things like water and air quality. They absorb pollutants from the air and particulate matter, so that helps reduce asthma or respiratory illnesses. And areas with more trees provide a lot of benefits. So especially in our urban areas, those areas might have higher air pollution or flood risks. And so they're actually helping to reduce both of those. And they're also helping to reduce the urban heat island effect. So they can lower air conditioning needs by as much as 30% by providing natural shade. I know at my house, I actually have a huge oak tree behind my house that shades. It's on the south side of my house, so it shades my house as the sun is going by. And actually, I really do believe that I use less air conditioning because of that. So it can help lower your energy consumption overall. So trees, I think, are just really, really important if you ever have the opportunity to promote tree plantings in your area or, to reduce trees from being cut down. It really can, make a difference. You also should, stay informed about what's going on in your community. So promote sustainability and actions within your workplace and your home. Talk to others about climate change. Really making sure you know what's going on within your city or your county can be really important because so many counties and cities in Florida are doing great work. And so if you can help, champion those, it really helps, the staff and those communities to say, oh yeah, we really should be putting money towards these things because our community really wants us to. There's so many wonderful communities that are doing great work in Florida. We really are ahead of the game, even if you think we might not be, but we are. And then just talk to others, talk to your neighbor, read more about climate change and what's going on. Join local organizations or groups, just think about ways that you can have your voice be heard and let others know about your thoughts. That just lets more people understand and be knowledgeable about, climate change and what's going on. So this is my last slide in my take home message. I do want you to know it's not too late to plan. So we should continue to do everything that we're already doing to mitigate and adapt to climate change. And it usually starts with a plan. So that's really important. The problem isn't insurmountable. I know many of the words that you guys were, put down were really there's no use, everything is horrible, but there are a lot of things that we can do and already a lot of things that are being done right now to adapt and mitigate to climate change. So, we just need to move forward and continue to do those things and more. So our decisions today can deliver a socioeconomic, built and natural systems that withstand change and improve the quality of life for everyone. And then last, I just wanted to point out that, even though I did say, we are doing a lot of great things and, it's not insurmountable and we have to have a plan. We know that sea level rise and climate change projections are not getting better. So, there's new reports out that show we're not doing enough and we need to do more. So we need to be aggressive and bold and continue to plan today. And science will continue to update. So we had the latest IPCC report. NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, just released a couple weeks ago a new sea level rise technical report with updated sea level rise scenarios for the United States. So science is always updating and always working on this. So we're always going to get new data. And so it's just important to know what's going on right now and what other things we can do to move forward. And that's it.
Thank you, Holly. That was a really great summary of our current state of climate change. And I love that you ended with some positive action items that we can all do, because it's easy to get a little down in the dumps. I definitely go there sometimes.
Yeah.
So we have about 10 minutes, a little over 10 minutes for questions. So please, if you have questions, go ahead and put those in the chat. And I'm gonna go and back up a little bit to some of the questions that were asked earlier. Some of these may have been answered in the course of your talk, but maybe not. So let's see, I'm going back up to 320. So Irina asked, I think you were showing a map of sea level rise across the continents, or across the globe actually. Mm-hmm. And she was wondering how the interior of the continents is affected by sea level rise.
So mainly they'd be affected by any like rivers and streams that would go to the ocean. So a lot of that water can build up and kind of continue into the interior. And it also will be affected by those areas maybe flooding more just from rain events. So like if the water levels within like streams and rivers like increase or kind of like backing up because of sea level rise, water might not be able to drain as much like into those areas. Either the land becomes super saturated or the water level of the rivers and streams are just too high to like take in more water. So really we're probably going to be affected by just more flooding because the water can't drain, and like get away from areas.
Great, thank you. And before I forget, I'm going to launch a quick poll. It's just 3 questions. If everyone can just answer these questions really quick, we will continue to answer your questions as well. So I'm just going to launch this poll. Once you answer the questions, you can close that on your screen. So the next question in the chat is asking about, I think what he's asking is, how are natural communities impacted by climate change compared to human population growth? So I'm guessing he's asking, is climate change or human population growth affecting natural communities more?
Probably both would be my guess. So, our population of the world isn't necessarily decreasing. So, people are going to have to move into different and more areas. If you think about here in Florida, one of the big ways natural communities will be affected is that people will have to move away from the coasts. Like there will be a time at some point where people won't be able to live, along the current coastline that we have. So they'll have to move inland. And so they're going to have to move into areas that probably aren't developed yet. Because we, as you know, already have housing shortages now. So, there's just less places for people to move to. But natural areas are affected in general by climate change just because of the same things that affect us: increased temperatures, increased precipitation or flooding, or less water stress. So those are all going to affect natural areas as well. So it's not just us that'll be affected by it.
Okay, and he asked, aren't daily low temperatures more impacted than average or high temperatures, such that we aren't cooling off at night?
Yes. Yeah, good point. Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah. So the increase in nighttime temperatures. So like say normally it would get down like in the 60s at night, that allows us to cool off. So like even if it's hot during the day, we kind of, our bodies are able to cool down, especially if we're can't go into an area of like air conditioning or where we can cool off. But those nighttime temperatures are actually increasing at a faster rate than the daytime temperatures. So it'll make it so that people don't have the ability to cool off or to like have their bodies like get to a lower temperature. And so that will actually affect health greater or faster, I guess you could say. So we'll see more effects because of that. And we'll probably see that a lot like in areas that already are getting hot, right? Like that are already hot. Those are the areas that are having those nighttime temperatures increase as well. So it's a huge public health factor.
Okay, and this is another question from Ed asking about shifts in precipitation patterns. Is precipitation in Florida moving to warmer months? so there will be less available water to recharge groundwater?
I don't know the answer to that because there's still a lot of research that needs to go into what precipitation will look like in Florida. So it's still sort of an unknown. Because we already are in general a wet state, it's a little bit harder to predict, whether or not we'll see less water or more water and what the precipitation will look like. We just don't have a good idea about that yet.
Okay, you may have answered this, but I'm not sure. How does El Nino and Southern Oscillation affect the temperature and rain patterns?
Oh yeah, it affects it a lot. So El Nino and La Nina, those different patterns of rainfall or being more dry or more wet or different temperatures, yeah, it does affect a lot. So like we are able to kind of take into account what that might do as far as those seasonal patterns. I'm not sure if there's been any work, and there might be, looking at how those will change over time, with increasing CO2 levels, or how they might increase in intensity or decrease. I'm not really sure, but those things are still taken into effect when we're thinking about, increased precipitation, increased temperature, because we know that there is that cycle.
Okay, let's see. And so Martin asked, you may not know the answer to this. He's asking about when you showed us the graph of the county risks across the national survey. He's asking what the scale was, or maybe if you could talk more
yeah,
about...
I think it was a 1 to 10 scale. So like 10 being like worse. So like if you were, I think some of them were like at 8, 9 or 8 or 9. So that's really bad, versus like a 1 is not as bad.
Okay. Irina posted a question: as homeowners use less water, does this give planners to actually approve more building permits?
If homeowners use less water, I'm not sure. I guess there would have to be some way to measure that over time, and then to show that new homeowners would not. But I don't know how that would change like building permits. I don't know if that's even taken into effect. I don't know if like water scarcity or more water in an area affects where buildings are built. I'm not sure.
Okay, and I'm just kind of get the chat here. There's a lot of conversation about benefits of trees, how trees use less water than grass, and yes, I agree with that point. Those are all good things. I actually shared the iTree website, which is a great little tool to measure your benefits of trees if you want to plant more trees in your yard.
Yeah, I just saw like another presentation like not too long ago that had that tree graphic, and I was like, oh my God, that's the best graphic ever. I was like, I need to add that to my presentations about trees. They're so important.
Yeah, and the
so
iTree is really cool. Native grasses. So, you might not know the answer to this, but maybe you do. Joyce asked, who are our friends in the state legislature?
That's a good question. I do not know. You'd have to contact your local legislator and ask them what they're doing about climate change or how they feel about it. I should say, I guess, that Ron DeSantis has been a big proponent of climate change. So when he came into office, he created the first like climate resiliency officer for the state. And so there's a whole program for climate resiliency for Florida now. And before it was really kind of like communities and cities and counties like doing the work individually. But now there's a whole office that it's kind of like helped to support all those communities that are doing that work. So.
Okay, and our last question, then we'll wrap it up here. Marilyn asked, as sea levels and salinity rise, how will that affect the Florida aquifers?
That's a great question. So we already are seeing what's called saltwater intrusion. And this mainly happens along the coastline. So where salt, because we have less water in our aquifers than we normally would because they're used for our water supply in a lot of areas. Well, in most areas, depending on where you live. So some areas use like rivers, like if you live in my area of the state, Brevard County, St. John's River, you use the St. John's River as your water source. But some places do use aquifers, and because we take water out of the aquifer for drinking water and for bottled water as well, salt water actually, because we have a karst topography, so we actually are like basically underneath our feet, it like looks like Swiss cheese. So we have like all these different holes and crevices. That's just what our what it looks like because of there used to be underwater, used to be lots coral reefs and other things like that. So there's lots of holes. That's a whole geology lesson that I'm not sure I'm qualified to talk about. But because of that, salt water can actually get in underneath us into the aquifer. And so we've seen areas where, like, if you used to have wells like near the coastline, those wells have become saline, so salty. So you have to either dig a deeper well to get past that, or a more shallow well, I think, depending on where you're located. So yeah, so that has effect. That's really well studied in South Florida. And then there's still other areas that are also be affected, and they need to look at that, but that will affect our aquifer in some areas of the state along our coast.
All right, Holly, it is 4 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and wrap up. And I want to thank you again for being here and presenting on this very important topic. I'll give you a chance if you want to say any final words, and then we'll close.
Yeah, thank you everyone for being here today. And I hope you learned something, and please spread the word about climate change and planning, and learn what's going on in your community and what's being done. I'm sure there's something happening. So, please get involved if you can.
All right, thank you. Thank you everyone for being here.